Hey, good evening. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Gadi Schwartz coming to you from Los Angeles. And here are some of the stories we're watching tonight, starting with the Supreme Court's decision to effectively get rid of affirmative action when it comes to college admissions.
We cannot let this decision be the last word.
So why did the court decide to get rid of the kind of affirmative action that it supported in the past? Meanwhile, a task force here in California is outlining who can get reparations for the harms of slavery.
As with our struggle for justice, let's take part in making history instead of being its bystanders.
And police are looking into a possible hate crime in Canada. That's after a former student goes on a stabbing spree during a gender studies class. And it's been nearly 20 years in the making, but Virgin Galactic has finally sent its first paying customers to the edge of space.
Those on board are experiencing about 3 Gs at the moment. The trim is complete and Unity is in the vertical, headed toward space.
And we start tonight with reaction to a massive decision that just came down from the Supreme Court, effectively ending affirmative action at American colleges and universities. And at the center of all of it, Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill, whose use of race in admissions has been argued and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And tonight, a 6-justice majority says the way race is considered when it comes to who gets into those elite colleges and universities is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Students from both campuses are reacting to that decision. Take a look.
It's incredibly disheartening to hear, especially knowing the negative impact that will have on these institutions and on communities of color. And a decision like this does affect individuals, but it also affects families and it affects communities.
This is quite the blow to Harvard's community, but I like to think of it as an opportunity for us to take action and put pressure on Harvard. It could include taking away legacy and donor admissions and other things that give unfair advantages to communities of privilege.
I think it's really unfair for a lot of Asian Americans and the Asian American community to say this is unfair because my child isn't getting into a great school. While obviously it is frustrating to not get to where you want to go in school, those spots are being given to genuinely deserving people that are coming from low-income communities, that are coming from historically resilient spaces where higher education is their way out.
And the 6-3 ruling fell along ideological lines, with the 3 dissenting justices all appointed by Democrats. And in the White House today, the president gave a pretty surprising answer to a question. Take a listen.
Is this a rogue court?
This is not a normal court.
NBC News analyst Barbara McQuaid starts us off. Barbara, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start off with your thoughts on the ruling, and what do you think will actually change here?
Well, I don't think it was a surprise to court watchers with this super conservative majority. I think we knew that affirmative action was doomed when they took this case up in an effort to look at affirmative action in light of the case that's already on the books in Grutter versus Bollinger, where the court held in 2003 that as long as there is a compelling governmental interest, which they found to be diversity of a class, making the classroom experience richer for others, as long as a program was narrowly tailored to achieve that goal, that was permissible under equal protection of the Constitution. And instead, this court comes along and says, no, it's not. And there's a few things about this that I find disturbing. One is overturning precedent without looking at some of the normal rules we look at for overturning precedent, and really allowing one's worldview to substitute for legal analysis, which I get the feel is going on here. There's this idea by some that we must be colorblind in the world to achieve true equal justice under the law. But of course, the court has consistently held that no right is absolute, and that we may use what's called strict scrutiny, compelling governmental interest that's narrowly tailored, which is how affirmative action programs have existed in the past. And now this court is sort of overruling that precedent by saying colorblindness is the way to go. You cannot recognize things. And the other thing about this that I thought was disturbing is the court sort of suggested that if we can't measure progress and we can't say that the date, there's going to be an end to it, then we can't allow it to continue. Justice O'Connor in that Grutter case 20 years ago said, we hope that in 25 years affirmative action won't be necessary anymore. Well, you know, my view is that affirmative action won't be necessary when we don't have any more racism. And as long as we do, perhaps there is a necessity for that. So where does that leave us? I think that many college admissions offices are going to have to revamp how they think about their admissions process. I think most universities care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so we're going to have to think differently about how to achieve those goals now that they can no longer consider race in admissions decisions.
Back to what the president said earlier today. We just saw him do an interview on MSNBC where he seemed to clarify, but also kind of double down on what he said. Let's take a quick listen to that.
You said this court is not normal. What did you mean?
What I meant by that is it's done more to unravel basic rights and basic decisions than any court in recent history. And that's what I meant by not normal. It's gone out of its way to, I mean, for example, take a look at overruling Roe v. Wade. Take a look at what the decision today. Take a look at how it's ruled on a number of issues that have been precedent for 50, 60 years sometimes.
Well, there seem to be fighting words there, Barbara. Do you think that we're going to see some sort of action taken in the next coming weeks by this administration? Or is this, you know, everybody's talking about court packing, and yet court packing seems dead on arrival when it comes to what's going on in Congress right now?
Yeah, it's difficult to know what the right solution is, but this court is going to be with us for another generation. Many of these justices are young, and with a 6-3 majority, even if they lost a couple and President Biden had an opportunity to replace them or a successor, it's going to take 20 or 30 years or more before we see more balance in the court. These justices were selected for having a particular worldview, and they seem to be working to advance the agenda of that worldview. As President Biden said there, and I really want to sort of confirm what he says, you know, not a normal court. You know, normal is kind of an odd choice of words. It's hard to know what one means there. But I think what I hear him saying is it is not consistent what we think about when we think about judicial restraint and judicial humility. We defer to other branches of government and to universities to decide what is the best policy choice for them. And the courts are there to decide whether there is something about that violates the Constitution. And so ordinarily, the precedent said that the Grutter case allowed for race in admissions decisions as long as it was advancing that compelling governmental interest of advancing diversity, and that it was narrowly tailored to achieve that purpose. Instead, rather than saying we think that's the wrong test or we want to change the test, what they simply say is we think that was just wrong, you know, rather than looking at the normal factors for overturning precedent. And so that, I think, is what is so disturbing about this particular court. What can we do about it? I don't know, and I don't know that we're going to be able to see Congress agreeing to adding justices when I'm sure there are many people in Congress who thinks this is just exactly what they want.
And Barbara, here in California, I mean, we're watching this, and this is a state, a progressive state, where affirmative action was banned decades ago when it wasn't so progressive. In fact, Steve Kornacki explained what happened when it came up again on the ballot just a few years ago when there was a progressive push to try to get that repealed. Take a look.
In '96, by initiative petition, California banned affirmative action. Supporters of affirmative action in 2020 thought the world had changed in California. More diverse, more liberal. It was time to put it back on the ballot. They believed voters would reinstate affirmative action for public universities. Instead, it went down 57 to 43. This is on the same day that Joe Biden was winning California by 30 points, reinstating affirmative action in public colleges and universities in one of the most liberal states in the country. Lost by 14 points.
And Barbara, real quick here, what do you think that says about how the rest of the country is now going to adapt along similar lines?
Well, it may be a political question, but you know, it seems to me that universities are those that are best situated to decide what is best in the name of academic freedom for the best learning environment on their campuses. And it is there that people want to have that sort of diversity in the classroom. You know, if you put it to a vote, you know, people get the feel that something feels unfair about admissions decisions. But if you look at all the different factors that get considered, legacy, you know, did your parent or grandparent go to this university? Athletic representation on teams, people get admitted for that reason. There are all kinds of other things that people get admitted for that considers the makeup of the class so that it can be diverse. They want geographic diversity. They want international diversity. They want people who are interested in various kinds of things, who bring different talents and perspectives. But now race is one that you cannot consider. And it suggests to me a lack of color blindness is really a blindness to the realities of the world.
Barbara Quaid, thanks so much for that analysis. Now, in order to see where we are today, it's important to take a look at how far we've come. So we're going to take a quick look into the NBC archives to 45 years ago, almost to the day when justices handed down another landmark decision on affirmative action. Now, this goes back to June of 1978 in a case brought by a 35-year-old white man who applied twice to medical schools in the University of California systems, but was denied. And here's how NBC Nightly News reported on it that night.
What happened at the University of California may not end special admissions programs, but it will redefine the rules. Today's Supreme Court decision said a university can take race into account as one element in a well-balanced admissions program, but the court also said that the mere desire to help groups because of past injustices did not justify inflicting harm on Alan Bakke, who bore no responsibility for the past. Bakke, who was generally hidden from sight since the case was argued, was not in the courtroom when the decision came. The case was heard more than 8 months ago, and even after all this time, there was no meeting of the minds of the justices. Berger, Stewart, Rehnquist, and Stevens said they didn't have to reach a constitutional question. They said that Congress in 1964 outlawed racial standards, such as that which was used to exclude Bakke. The decisive fifth vote came from Justice Powell, who said the Constitution prohibits any playing of favorites on the basis of race. The four dissenters were Brennan, White, Marshall, and Blackmun, although Blackmun's dissent was a weak one, saying he regarded the California procedure as perhaps just barely constitutional.
And that was NBC's Carl Stern reporting. And to sum it up, back then, that decision basically found the use of racial quotas in admission unconstitutional, but schools using affirmative action to accept more minority students was constitutional in some circumstances. Now, fast forward to today, where we just saw Justice Sonia Sotomayor write one of the dissenting opinions in this decision. Now, in the past, she has said she was a perfect affirmative action baby. She benefited from those policies, and today she blasted the decision. She called a, quote, superficial rule of colorblindness as a constitutional principle in an endemically segregated society. And joining us now is Professor Danielle Hawley. She is the outgoing dean at Howard University School of Law and the incoming president of Mount Holyoke College. Thank you so very much for joining us. I want to ask about Sotomayor's opinion. Do you think that we live in a colorblind society?
Absolutely not. I think what Justice Sotomayor and what Justice Jackson said in their dissents are exactly right, that the Supreme Court may want to wipe away the notion of race in law, but they can't wipe it away from everyday life. And Justice Sotomayor gave the example of how many students who are Black and Latino and Native American attend schools K through 12 that are largely segregated and have less resources. And we know that generationally, students of color were, including Asian students, were kept from attending many of these schools altogether. So I thought one of the most interesting things about this opinion is what it left out. Chief Justice Roberts in the majority talks about when the schools were founded, Harvard and UNC, but there's no mention in his history of the explicit racial segregation and racial discrimination against Black students and other minority students throughout almost the entire history of Harvard and UNC. And even though the constitutional framework is one of pursuing educational benefits of diversity is the compelling interest. So that's what was interesting about the Bakke segment that you just saw, is Bakke really established 45 years ago that the chief justification for affirmative action is reaping the educational benefits from diversity, not remedying past discrimination. But it just seems like the majority opinion is untethered from the reality of race in America today and the history of the way race has been used against students of color throughout almost the entire history of schools like Harvard and University of North Carolina.
I'm not sure if you heard Barbara in the segment before, but she talked about how, at the beginning, affirmative action, the whole point was to not need affirmative action in the future. And at that point, the benchmark was maybe 25 years. Do you think that we may be close to not needing affirmative action, or how far off do you think that might be?
No, it's interesting that I think that part of the Grutter decision in which Justice O'Connor says, there should be a sunset provision for this, and maybe it will be 25 years. I think what we've seen is many schools have gone backwards in terms of progress. I attended a highly selective undergraduate institution and law school, and that was back in the 1990s. And there are less Black students on those campuses now than there were at the time that I attended. So I think if anything, we've slipped backwards in terms of what we're doing in terms of admissions in highly selective colleges and universities for Black and Latino and Native students. And so I think this decision will make things even harder in that way. But certainly the sunset provision that Justice O'Connor talked about is one that we have not seen the kind of progress that you would like to see to end a policy like affirmative action.
Professor Hawley, thanks so much. Justice Clarence Thomas, who voted to strike down affirmative action, also wrote an opinion on today's decision saying the Constitution supports the idea that, quote, we are all equal and should be treated equally before the law without regard to our race. Thomas's alma mater, Holy Cross, sent an email to alumni shortly after condemning the decision altogether, but avoided naming Thomas. Joining us now is May Malin. She is a senior legal fellow at the Women's Law Center. May, thanks so much for being with us. Justice Thomas said everyone is treated equal before the law, regardless of race. Do you agree?
Well, Justice Thomas acknowledged that in our country, we might not all be colorblind. You, and I just walking around, we see America, we each have our own experiences. But under the Constitution sets forth rules that are our ideal that we must work toward. And we did an experiment. You talked about, 45 years ago, we thought, well, why don't we just see how this goes, see how sort of racial balancing and diversity goes as far as checking a box with race and seeing how the class looks. And it hasn't gone well. The number of students at the bottom income quartile that are allowed into universities is not particularly higher than it was then. Test scores for African Americans is not noticeably higher than it was. And so it's hard to say, looking back at 45 years, I'm really proud of the progress that has been made. And instead, even the last guest said there's been less diversity. And Thomas, in a lot of his opinions, has said, well, how can you be surprised by that? If you're telling a group of people that you put a badge of inferiority on people and you say you don't have to have the same grades, you don't have to have the same test scores, of course people are not going to level up if they are told not to. So I reject, I guess, the idea that the past 45 years have shown us the benefits of the old system, and that the culmination was Harvard literally discriminating against Asian students who were poor and who had no opportunity, and telling them it doesn't matter.
Who do you think benefits from affirmative action?
So, I think we should separate affirmative action, which will still happen and universities can still use, and then racial discrimination, which universities cannot use. So as universities move forward and try to have to achieve the benefits of diversity, which I think is good. I went to Harvard, and it was nice to have law students who are not exactly like me. I was a poor kid from Kansas. I was there with kids from all over the place. As people should seek affirmative action, it should be people who haven't had the same opportunities as maybe somebody who graduated from a private college, private high school on the Upper East Side. And that could look like a lot of things. That could look like poor kids. That could look like kids whose parents didn't go to college. That could look like kids who only had one parent or no parents. That could look like kids from small towns. That could look like kids from inner cities. That could look like a whole bunch of things. But what it shouldn't look like is tell me what race you are, because that tells me nothing about how you think. Black people think all sorts of things. White people think all sorts of things. Asian people, it doesn't tell me anything about your diversity. It tells me about your skin color. And if we want to target, you know, the people who have been negatively affected by slavery, then we should be looking at that story. Tell me about that story, and then benefiting the people who have been harmed by their circumstances.
May, we really appreciate your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And there was a verdict today in the Parkland High School massacre, but no, not for the shooter. It was for a former deputy. We're going to explain just ahead, so stay tuned.
His inaction contributed to the shock and devastation of students and teachers at that school.
Hey there, welcome back, and let's take a look at some of the other headlines we're watching tonight. New Mexico State University will pay out $8 million to settle a harassment lawsuit. Now, 2 basketball players said they were sexually assaulted by their teammates, and each defendant will get about $4 million each. And today in Los Angeles, we learned homelessness rates in LA County are up 9% over the past year, all coming after the city's new mayor, Karen Bass, has been pushing to spend over $1 billion to help homeless people. And it looks like rapper Travis Scott is not going to face any charges after his deadly concert in Houston when a massive crush of people started pushing towards the stage. A grand jury decided not to hold him criminally responsible after 10 people died and thousands were hurt at his Astroworld show in 2021. The CDC is recommending RSV vaccines for older adults. This would pave the way for Americans over 65 to get the shot in the fall. But the panel has also recommended the vaccine for people in their early 60s who are at higher risk. And something happened yesterday in baseball that hasn't happened in over a decade. Yankees pitcher Domingo Germán threw a perfect game. This is the 24th perfect game in the history of the major leagues. The Yankees beat the Oakland A's 11-0. Now on to Florida, where Scott Peterson was just acquitted on all charges. Remember, this is the former school officer at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. He was working in Parkland the day 17 students and staff were shot and killed. Peterson was charged with failing to confront the shooter during that attack. Now, here's NBC's Kathy Park with all the details.
The defendant is not guilty.
Tonight, former school resource officer Scott Peterson breaking down in the courtroom as he listened to a Florida jury acquit him on all counts of negligence.
Got my life back.
We got our life
We've
back.
got our life back after 4.5 years.
Prosecutors argued Peterson should be held accountable for staying back more than 45 minutes as students and staff at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School were being gunned down by Nicholas Cruz.
Every time the trigger is being pulled, another child is being shot. He stands there with the knowledge of a 28-year deputy assigned to protecting children, knowing that the #1 goal in that moment is move towards the sounds of gunfire.
Peterson did not take the stand, but his lawyer said his client didn't know where the shots were coming from.
He stands there, vulnerable as you can be, risking his life, and gets on the radio and yells shots fired, because every second does matter.
After Parkland, police response to school shootings gained even more attention. From the fallout after Uvalde to the Covenant School in Nashville, when officers took down the shooter within minutes of the first call. But tonight, families forever tied to the Parkland tragedy aren't letting Peterson off the hook.
I believe law enforcement officers have a tough job. I know most of them are dedicated. But clearly, when it came time, Deputy Peterson turned tail and ran.
But a jury disagrees, and Peterson has said he'll be haunted by that day for the rest of his life. Kathy Park, NBC News.
What do we want? When? What do we want? When?
They're talking about reparations there, and it has been years in the making. But today, the first of its kind reparations task force in California presented its final report to state lawmakers. Now, the more than 1,000-page document outlines both the impact of slavery as well as recommendations for compensating eligible descendants of slaves. And joining us now is NBC's Dana Griffith. Dana, so people are going to see this. They're going to say, OK, task force. OK, 1,000-page report.
Yeah.
But like, Is there an actual chance that people could see money coming out of what we saw today?
Possibly, but it's a very uphill battle. You know, this is not just about cash payments. There are some 115 recommendations. So I know the $1.2 million that economists have projected has been the big headliner here, but the task force really wants to underscore that there are other things that could be done to help rectify the harms that California played a role in post-slavery. And they include approving a state apology for racism, adopting a K-12 Black Studies curriculum, a ban on cash bail, and reimbursing the exonerated. Also, they want to get rid of the death penalty here. They want to provide housing grants in formerly red-line neighborhoods, expand resources for children in foster and kinship care. They want to declare Election Day a paid state holiday. And they also want to establish the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency. That will be the state agency in charge of dealing with everything reparations, including possibly making sure lineage-based requirements are followed through. They'll do the genealogy work and also make those payments if that is adopted. So
if this is adopted, let's take it from the point of somebody that may or may not know their genealogy. What happens then? Have they worked any of that out?
They haven't worked that out, and that's the big mystery here, because they want to make this lineage-based so that you have to be a direct descendant of an enslaved person, but that takes a lot of work. And when you think about it, some records have been destroyed, and even enslaved people were not identified by name until after that first census, since after the Civil War. So trying to determine your lineage is very tough. We actually did a story with a genealogist, a professional genealogist. It took her decades and thousands of dollars just to uncover her own family's history. So imagine people who are standing in line saying, hey, I want to get my genealogy done. That could take years, Gadi. So when it comes to when people could see payments, that is still up in the air.
Is there a price tag to all of this? I mean, what are the recommendations when it comes to how much this could cost?
So here's the thing, and it's kind of a misconception. People think that the task force is recommending this $1.2 million, an exact dollar amount. They're not. But what they did is they had economists come, they created this model, and based upon all of the harms that they believe California contributed to, and depending on how long you lived in California, say one person who has lived here the longest and experienced every harm done could receive up to $1.2 million. But take a look at this. That could cost the state some $800 billion. You know, the state budget, which was approved on Tuesday by Governor Newsom, as you see it there, $310 billion, and we're already trying to rectify a $32 billion deficit, Gadi. So that's the big concern, especially from critics who say, where's the money going to come from? So we're expecting possible lawsuits to come from this, people who are going through it with a fine-tooth comb to try to say, is this really good for California?
So it would be just I'm trying to figure out the math still in my head, but it sounds like $500 million more than the state budget.
Exactly.
Got it. Dana Griffith, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
And coming up, Target, Disney, and Bud Light are all dealing with people ditching their brands. But what makes a boycott a success or a complete bust? We're going to explain that in just a bit. But first, you got to see this. Testing the strength of your love. This is a wife-carrying contest, and it was held at a Scandinavian midsummer festival in Canada. And they say that once upon a time in the small villages of Finland, if you wanted to marry a woman, you had to carry her off physically. This was supposed to prove your worth as a husband, or the story goes. But these days, the tradition is an annual obstacle. And you could also win your wife's weight in beer. We'll be right back. Hey there, welcome back. Let's get you caught up in 30 seconds. The Supreme Court today ruled against affirmative action at colleges and universities where race played a role in the admissions process. And former school resource officer Scott Peterson was acquitted of all charges for failing to confront the Parkland school shooter back in 2018. And if you're traveling this weekend, try to mentally prepare yourself. TSA is expecting to screen 3 million people tomorrow alone. And a man in Canada has been charged in a triple stabbing at the University of Waterloo. Canadian police say the attacker entered a gender studies class yesterday. He apparently asked the professor what the class was about, then started stabbing him. The teacher and 2 students are expected to recover. NBC News Now correspondent Nyla Charles has this story.
A targeted attack on a gender studies professor has a college campus on edge.
The guy basically walked in and asked the teacher if he was a professor. He said yeah, then
He pulled out a knife. The guy attacked our professor with two very big knife from the very big backpack.
It happened Wednesday at the University of Waterloo in Canada. Police are investigating it as a hate crime related to gender expression and gender identity.
This incident is a tragic reminder during Pride Month that as we celebrate our progress, the safety and well-being of some in our community is still in question.
2 students were also stabbed.
I think we all know that there's a polarization in society right now, both online and in the real world, and there's conversations that are spilling over into everyday life.
Police arrested Giovanni Villalba Ailman. He recently graduated from the school.
We must make it exceptionally clear that hate or prejudice in any form is unacceptable. Gender-based violence undermines the dignity and the rights of all residents.
According to a study from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, across the world, rising hate and extremism are posing an existential threat to human rights. It says there was a rise in hate crimes against the queer community in the U.S., UK, France, Germany, and Canada. In the U.S., these crimes range from the burning of rainbow flags and attacks on pride displays to mass murder at a Colorado Springs gay nightclub. Dr. Susan Stryker is a research fellow at the Stanford University Humanities Center. She started teaching gender studies in the 90s.
Have you noticed opinions towards your field of study change?
It has become the topic of a moral panic, particularly the idea that gender studies is somehow leading to some kind of like epidemic of trans people.
Do you worry about your safety?
I do have it in my mind when I'm doing things in public that, there could be violence.
The Canada attack, a reminder of fears on both sides of the border.
And Nyla Charles joins us now in the studio. Nyla, what are other gender studies professors saying after this?
Well, there's a real concern out there, Gadi. They say although the attack in Canada is a wake-up call for a lot of people, for them, they unfortunately saw this as a potential threat. So they say there's a misunderstanding for what exactly they teach. And because of that, we've heard of teachers who are scared to teach at night, opting for Zoom classes instead. Some of them even using different names when they teach because they're scared of violence against them, but also their families.
Nyla Charles, thanks so much. And turning now to boycotts. Boycotts have been a hot topic of conversation lately. You might think they're pointless or possibly a powerful tool for change, but before we talk about whether they're effective or not, let's take a moment to define what a boycott actually looks like. From the American Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement to consumer boycotts, a call to action seems to be an American tradition. Take a look.
Our city commission has flatly turned down our offer to work with an interracial committee on the matter of seating on our city buses. And now that the bus company has deserted us, it is now incumbent upon us, the council, to provide transportation for our people. Ours is not a white and black battle. Instead, it is a struggle between justice and injustice. It will be a victory for democracy.
From bus boycotts and sit-ins in the 1950s and 60s in the South to the Native American movement in the 70s, those are just a few examples of how boycotts in America have been used as a tool for social and political change. To this day, the United States government has a decades-old economic embargo on Cuba, just as the Arab League has imposed a trade embargo on Israel since its founding. And that brings us to more modern forms of boycotting. We see it all the time, targeting businesses for their political and social stances.
We're all truly blessed at the same time to have a leader like President Trump.
Remember when Goya Foods was getting backlash for the CEO's relationship with Donald Trump? But that negative publicity might have actually helped the company. And it hasn't been that long since Chick-fil-A was getting called out for its donations to anti-LGBTQ groups. But it seems like people kept buying their chicken anyway, not really affecting the bottom line.
I probably spend like $50 a month. Then I reduced my Chick-fil-A intake when the first round of Chick-fil-A is anti-gay came out.
More recent boycotts have gone the other way on gay rights.
We're opposed to the agenda, the indoctrination. That really isn't their jurisdiction to be raising our children and teaching them about sex.
And ransacking of Target's Pride section during Pride Month.
Honestly, Target, what is going on? This is pretty disgusting.
These are like naked people in shirts.
But Bud Light is taking the biggest hit of all of them, and this boycott is actually working. Sales are down 25% from last year. And joining us now is Maurice Schweitzer. He is a professor of operations, information, and decisions at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Professor, thanks so much for joining us here. So I got to ask, I mean, looking at all those different boycotts, what makes a boycott work and what makes a boycott fizzle out?
Yeah, for a boycott to be effective, it takes leadership, coordination, and persistence. And on the other side, it takes easy alternatives and a company that's sensitive to the press. In general, boycotts don't work because people lack attention to it. They're unlikely to actually change their mode of transportation or their consumer behavior. So people might try to boycott tuna, or they might try to boycott Target. They might try to boycott all kinds of companies, or BP for the oil spill, but then find themselves reverting to convenient patterns. And we tend not to see boycotts work most of the time. And this is especially the case. You mentioned Goya before, where in some cases they're what we call two-sided boycotts, where there are people, for example, that might like that Goya was affiliated with Trump when other people call for a boycott, or Patagonia sued the Trump administration when the Trump administration shrank the Bears Ears National Monument, and their sales actually went up. So we see two-sided boycotts where people are taking one of two sides, and so a call to boycott might not actually harm the company. And then we see, yeah, go ahead.
Real quick, sorry, you're talking about two-sided in one way, but that makes me think of kind of just calling it how it looks right now. It looks like boycotts that are coming from the left have not been effective recently, and yet boycotts that are coming from the right have been pretty effective. What do you think that it's an overgeneralization, but do you think that's the case? And if so, why?
Well, I think that's interesting. So I think So compared to one-sided boycotts, like when people are boycotting SeaWorld or BP after an oil spill, it's not as if people are taking the other side of, the mistreatment of animals or an oil spill. But here, I think you have a good point. That is, we're seeing a rise in the effectiveness of some kinds of boycotts, although most of them haven't really been very effective. So I think the Bud Light example recently, I think it comes in the midst of a very intense culture war and the ramp up of a presidential election. So the Republican primary started, and I think the issue of liberal ideals, I think, is coming at a very intense time. And so that's why the Target example, the Bud Light example, I think are running into a very different landscape than we've seen in other cases.
Perfect. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And after the break, an update on the violence in Paris. The streets are once again filled with protesters after a 17-year-old was shot by police. We're going to bring you the latest, so stay tuned. Hey there, welcome back. Let's head around the world real fast in 80 seconds. A third straight night of violence and unrest in France after the police shooting of a 17-year-old boy in a suburb of Paris on Tuesday. Now, French officials say so far about 180 people have been arrested and 170 officers have been hurt. In Sweden, a man burned a Quran during a protest outside of Stockholm at a mosque there yesterday, and Swedish police granted a permit for that demonstration. And that was a move that has angered a number of Muslim countries, including Turkey, which has been holding up Sweden's request to join NATO. And British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been told his plan to send thousands of asylum seekers to Rwanda is against the law. He was told this today by the UK's top court. Sunak believes Rwanda is a safe country and that the British government should decide who arrives in the UK. He and other ministers are looking to appeal the court ruling. And take a look at this scene in Japan. A port in Okinawa turned blood red after a food coloring dye from a brewery leaked into the river. Now, that issue is thought to have come from one of the brewery's cooling systems. The Orion Brewery has since apologized and told everyone that the food coloring posed no danger to humans or fish. And today in Ukraine, former Vice President Mike Pence made a surprise appearance. The 2024 hopeful met with President Zelensky, making him the first Republican presidential candidate to do so. And while Pence's outspoken support for Ukraine is nothing new, his strong stance on the matter does set him apart from his GOP rivals. NBC's Dasha Burns is in Kyiv with more.
Gadi, what we saw here on the ground in and around Kyiv today was a collision between the 2024 presidential campaign in the U.S. and the war in Ukraine. Vice President Mike Pence, the former vice president, paying a visit here, the first GOP presidential candidate to do so, potentially the only one, as this is the one major issue where there is a very stark divide within the GOP. And right now, Mr. Pence is really in the minority in his party, where you've had his former boss, former President Trump, go so far as to occasionally praise, even defend Vladimir Putin. You've got Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who has called this war a territorial dispute. He's walked that back. And just generally, though he does not necessarily support funding and the U.S. involvement of the war in Ukraine, Pence, however, has sent a very clear message, that message resounding today, that he believes that the U.S. should play a leading role in supporting Ukraine. He made that very clear today. He spent time visiting critical sites that were occupied and ravaged by the Russians, meeting families whose homes were destroyed, paying tribute to fallen soldiers, to civilians who were killed in this war, and really taking it all in, spending the day here with the people who were most affected. But it is not necessarily a visit that is going to court the Republican primary voters that he needs to win this primary. I asked him about that. Take a listen. The majority of Republican voters are less likely to support a candidate that is in support of funding for Ukraine. So this is not likely to be a campaign stop, so to speak, that is particularly fruitful for you with the GOP voters you're trying to court. So why are you here?
I'm here because it's important that the American people understand the progress that we've made and how support for the Ukrainian military has been in our national interest. I truly do believe that now more than ever, we need leaders in our country who will articulate the importance of American leadership in the world. I mean, honestly, ever since we left office, it seems like the world's become more dangerous by the day. And for my part, I'm always going to step forward and speak the truth to the American people. We'll let the polls and the politics take care of themselves, but for me, it was important to be here.
This visit really underscores the major shift that we've seen in the Republican Party since Donald Trump took over as the leader of the GOP 5-10 years ago. There would not have been such a divide on an issue like this. This was a party that was very hawkish when it came to spreading democracy worldwide, when it came to limiting the power of Russia and its influence. But today, there is not unanimity within the GOP on this issue. It'll be interesting to see whether or not Mr. Pence, who was the first candidate to visit Ukraine, whether or not he is the last. Gadi.
Dasha Burns, thanks so much. Now, imagine spending over $200,000 for a ticket to space, only to have to wait 10 years to go. Well, hopefully it was worth the wait, because next, a look at Virgin Galactic's first ever commercial flight. So a lot of our tech here in the United States relies on chip production in Taiwan, and I mean a lot. But right now, the CIA thinks China wants to invade Taiwan by 2027, which would put all those microchip factories at risk. And NBC's Richard Engel got a rare peek inside one of those factories.
Taiwan often compares itself to David facing down Goliath. The small island is just 100 miles off the Chinese mainland. China claims it's a breakaway province, and the CIA believes China wants to be ready to invade Taiwan within 4 years. Taiwan says Chinese fighter jets fly dangerously close to Taiwanese airspace, and its warships encircle the island almost every day. Tonight, Taiwan's foreign minister with a stark warning.
I think China might be repeating what we saw as the origin of the Second World War, and we have to be careful.
How much risk is there that one of these daily incursions could start a fire?
It is possible.
A real conflict.
Yes, it is possible. If you look at the history of war, there are plenty of war out of accidents, out of inadvertent accidents.
The U.S. supplies Taiwan with weapons. Still, the island's 210,000 troops are no match for China's 2 million. But Ukraine was outgunned by Russia, too. And Ukraine's resistance has inspired Taiwan.
We have seen the very brave Ukrainian soldiers defending their territory, defending their freedom and sovereignty. And that is something that we want to learn.
But the people in Taiwan are not mobilizing for war. This week were the annual dragon boat races, and the crowds were the biggest in years.
You cannot live in fear. You have to keep going with your life.
Emily Wu is a podcaster and says what makes Taiwan unique from communist China and a target is its democracy.
What's it like when China does these flyovers and sends its warships nearby?
It's intimidating because what if one day it's just not an exercise?
The foreign minister told me he does not believe the threat to Taiwan is imminent, but said it is, quote, apparent and increasing.
And finally tonight, out of the New Mexico desert, ladies and gentlemen, please keep your hands and feet inside the spaceship because Virgin Galactic is now officially opening up its push to get tourists up into space. They have been launching some paying customers right off this planet, and here is how it works. You're seeing it right there. Instead of getting into a typical rocket, those 6 passengers got into a spacecraft that kind of looks like a plane. That's attached to an actual plane. They fly up to about 45,000 feet, then they shoot that spacecraft straight up where it reaches an altitude of about 50 miles above the Earth, hitting zero gravity for a few minutes. Now, I know what you're wondering, and yes, you too can take this flight, but you're going to need $450,000, and also you're going to have to get in line behind 800 people. Real quick, look back. Virgin Galactic. It was founded by British billionaire Sir Richard Branson. That was a dream born from his airline Virgin Galactic, or Virgin Atlantic, which actually came about when Branson found himself stuck in Puerto Rico with 50 other people. They were trying to get to the British Virgin Islands, so he chartered an old 747. He charged them $40 a seat. He made a profit. The rest is history. It makes you wonder whether or not we actually are living in a simulation, because next thing you know, people are going up to space. Joining us now is NBC News correspondent Marissa Parra. Marissa, I mean, first question, would you go?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. Do I have the money to go is another question. But as you just mentioned, there's at least 800 people out there who do have the upwards of $450,000 to spend and shell out on this. But yeah, I think you would too, Gadi. But what I think is so interesting about this, and you just mentioned it yourself, is when we look at how humans keep testing the limits of what we're capable of, look at the plane itself. I mean, this is unlike anything that we've ever covered when it comes to venturing to spaceflight. You're looking, that is the mothership right there. That is actually what they call it, by the way, and it looks like a commercial plane. Almost, sort of, with a couple of addendums, of course. Now, attached to it is the rocket-powered VSS Unity, and that launches off right there. You see that happening, and once they get high enough, they reach an altitude that's high enough, this actually reaches a speed that is 3 times the speed of sound, Gadi. You can only imagine what that sounds like. And so then it gently glides back down to Earth, landing on its own within the hour. The whole thing is supposed to take the actual entire trip, from the time it takes off to the time it comes back down to Earth. You can see a graphic of that. It's supposed to be anywhere between an hour 15 to an hour 30. Now, just remember how expensive this is. That is all for an hour 15 to an hour 30 trip, Gadi.
4Gs, 0Gs, 1G, 5Gs. I mean, it does look very exciting. The second question, though, is it safe? I mean, they've been through testing. They've had mishaps in the past. They've had a fatal accident. Where do they stand right now with safety? And does it seem like they've figured everything out to get this going maybe every week, maybe every other week here?
Well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? It's safe until they find a reason to see that it's not. It's certainly been tested. There has certainly been tests in the past that went well, and then there was, you know, the mishap in the past. But in terms of where things stand right now, yeah, as of right now, I think the only real serious criticism we're seeing are from there were a lot of comments and critiques on social media about this with the timing, right? There is some unfortunate timing with the fact that this is coming within a week of what happened under the sea with the Titan submersible. And so a lot of people are raising questions about adventure and extreme tourism, whether it's under the sea or whether it's, you know, in the skies. And so there's certainly some overlap there, but also kind of apples and oranges when it comes to the testing between the two. I think the only thing that there really is some overlap on is this is also a largely self-regulated industry as well, Gadi.
And Marissa, I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, there's a lot to say about whether this is just a joyride or whether it's for scientific advancement. Do you see those two kind of going hand in hand at all?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the way Virgin Galactic sees this is the choice is yours, right? So on this trip in particular, of the 4 paying passengers, 3 of them were either Italian researchers or made up of Italian Air Force officers, and they had 13 research payloads. In fact, if you were to look at the video of them, as soon as they reached microgravity, you talked about how they only had a few minutes of microgravity in space, and man, did they take advantage of every second. There goes one of them all the way to the back to unload the payload, if you will. He's going straight there because he knows time is of the essence. And then the next thing he does is take out an Italian flag. But, you know, when it comes to the research, one of the most interesting experiments, Gadi, I just have to end on this, I know we're out of time, was looking at the impact of microgravity itself on these passengers, because this was such a quick acceleration. This was such a quick moment for them to experience this, where normally astronauts are spending, if not days, weeks, or months in space. This was in a matter of minutes. So they had heart rate monitors and all kinds of monitors all over them to look at that. So yeah, to really sum up the answer here, I think it's a version of both. You're going to have people going up into space for $450,000 just for fun, not to do any research. And Virgin Galactic is like, we'll take your money, whatever you want.
Oh, one quick thing. If we could pull up that video again. I mean, when he gets out of the seat, you see him wearing something on his back. Is that a parachute? What is that thing? Is that sensors? Do we know what that
Gadi,
is?
I don't actually know. I wish I could tell you, and I will go and find the answer for you. But it does.
I'm
it does look interesting. I know that they have monitors on them. I know that the monitors are there to see how their body, especially their heart rate, is responding to the quick acceleration between hypergravity to microgravity and back to hypergravity, which is something that really very few humans have ever been through. But we'll have to find out on that one. Yeah.
You know how we could find out? Let's see. GoFundMe, Marissa and Gadi. Go to space. It's like
I'll be the first to donate.
Give her, yeah, exactly. I'm starting it right now, Marissa. We'll see you out there. Thanks so much.
Sounds good.
And that does it for us tonight. I'm Gadi Schwartz. We'll see you tomorrow, but until then, stay tuned now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.